VCs, in many ways, are actually anthropologists who just happen to do finance. And I totally subscribe to that. On the big picture level, I think just the opportunities here in the UK and in Europe for tech. Yes, we're going through a bit of a downturn right now, but that opportunity is just huge. There are 2 times the number of technical developers, and yet the average salary is 40% less than the US. And on top of that, the total investment in tech is 60% less than the US. So just structurally, there's so much opportunity here, and we're already seeing it with more 1 billion, 10 billion, even 50 billion companies being created.
Today on the podcast, we have Alston Zecha, who is a partner at 8 Roads and was the exited co-founder of Payleven, which merged with SumUp. In this podcast, it's about his childhood, growing up in Hong Kong, being inspired by all the different entrepreneurs around him, then moving to the UK, where he was a bit different, and he had to try and stand out and find his own feet again. He tried to start up a startup, which failed in his early days because he didn't know the game. And then after that, he went back into the corporate world, where he was very successful, and then had another stab at it, and that was Payleven. And you might recognize what they do if you ever tried to buy some Contactless at many different places. So that was able to grow massively. It then merged with SumUp, and since then, he's done various things, and now he's a partner at 8 Roads, which invests in pan-Europe at different stages. He's been able to have this multitude of different things in his career, and we learned all about the different struggles he had along the way as well, and he's very passionate about showing what's possible for you. So, Alston, when you were growing up, what did you want to be? What were you thinking your future was going to look like?
Yeah, well, so after I figured out that running a sweet shop by night and working as a mountain climber wasn't really going to be a professional job, weirdly, I actually thought I wanted to go into banking. But to be fair, I was growing up in the 1980s in Hong Kong, and so everybody thought finance was cool. And so I'd always thought that I was definitely going to do something in the professional sphere. I think the other thing is I come from a family of entrepreneurs going back like 3 or 4 generations. And so growing up, there were lots and lots of stories about all the interesting different things that relatives had done. And so these were 2 things that really inspired me, definitely going in the field of commerce. And so I'd always assumed that I was going to do that. At the same time, I had 0 clue what exactly that was going to look like. I just thought, wow, I am going to, on the one hand, be materially well off, and on the other hand, I'm going to do cool things that are like going to make an impact on the business world. And then it took me another like 30 or 40 years to actually turn that into a career. And so, you know, if anybody looks at my CV, it might look utterly random because I've basically had like 5 different careers in a 25-year period.
And you said like going into banking, but you also had this entrepreneurship side. How did that marry up? Because banking is considered quite professional, quite corporate. But then you're also inspired by the entrepreneurs in your family. So how did that?
Well, I mean, firstly, you're now asking what was going through the mind of an 8-year-old. So, you know, be very careful about that. But no, look, I mean, like I said, I think what I'd always wanted to do was a business that was going to be big and meaningful. And I think that's also a reflection of the fact that, at least when I was a kid, I didn't really think too hard about which side of the table I was going to be on. And in a sense, you might even say that that's then been reflected in my career. I've had periods where I have been a banker or I have been a consultant, I have been an investor. And there's other times that I've been an operator in a larger company or I've actually been like running my own startup. So, but again, coming back to it, like I probably didn't think hard enough about it when I was 8 years old. So yeah, I mean, I guess water finds its own level eventually, doesn't it?
So once you like started your career, right? So you decided, okay, I'm going to go into banking to begin with, and then you went into that world. How did you find it? Were you enjoying it? Was it what you hoped it would be?
So I guess I've been really lucky on the one hand that I've always found something to enjoy in my different jobs, but different things. And it's probably only been after I'd been in the job for a while, or maybe even after I left that job, that I could reflect on the relative enjoyment of each of them. So I would always find something there, right? And especially when you're young in your 20s, the mantra is, look, just work hard, get great experiences, just don't be held back by anything. Like, this is your time just to build the foundations. And I'd never actually received that advice, but actually it's really, really good advice. You know, I think the reason why I only did banking for a short stint, and then in any case, I went back to studying before I then figured out what I was going to do, that was actually a really good break that I didn't get on that pure banking hamster wheel. That's when I tried my hand at my first startup. And that's when I then went into management consulting. And so that's probably the time that I did think to myself, oh, I probably want to do something a little bit more like business as opposed to finance oriented, pure finance oriented, something that was a little bit more operational, or at least closer to the operations. And so that's ever since then been very much more where my interests have lain.
And where in the world were you at this point as well? Because you obviously said you grew up in Hong Kong.
Ooh, okay, yeah. So I guess I'm going to have to keep this relatively brief. I grew up in Hong Kong. My parents moved to Thailand when I was a teenager, but I moved to the UK myself for studies when I was a teenager. And then I stayed here through university. So my first job was in Paris. And then that startup, that very first startup I mentioned, that was actually in Asia. So I was working a little bit in China and in Thailand. And then I started my first job in the UK in management consulting.
Because what's interesting, like we talked about this before as well, how a lot of people have been on this podcast and successful, like Asian entrepreneurs in the UK, often they've actually come from abroad and come with a different mindset, right? And you obviously grew up in Hong Kong where you're part of the majority. And then you've come to the UK and then you're part of a minority, and that different mindset. And how did you feel like across that journey? Did you ever feel like, was that a big thing for you, to that cultural shock, or was it not really something that affected you much?
My first day here as a kid in the UK at school, someone said to me very innocently, "Zecha, why is your skin so dark?" And that wasn't a racist thing. That was just like
curiosity,
but just curiosity, right? But from day one, it was very clear that I was other. And let's not forget, we actually are the global majority, but yes, we are the BAME, or however you pronounce it here, right? And so I do think certainly for me, I probably did benefit from having much more reference points, family in Asia of entrepreneurs, also family now Asian Americans, who some of whom are also entrepreneurs. That definitely helped me with my worldview. I don't think that needs to be that way. And I think we're starting to see many, many more British Asian entrepreneurs who are like born in the UK. But hopefully also, you know, the examples of people like me and other entrepreneurs, right, or business people who have come from abroad but are Asian here, that hopefully also widens the worldview of people. I definitely was aware that I was other. In many cases, that was a positive because it also meant that I had to work harder. I had to learn faster. I had to recognize that I had to have something that was better than me, because otherwise, you know, I wouldn't be able to stand out. So, you know, I think in my case, that ended up being a positive. I knew what was possible from having reference points outside, but it sort of forced me to up my game when I arrived here. But equally, it could go the other way, right? And I think that's why we're having this conversation, to try and, you know, focus on those positives.
Yeah, because you also mentioned there they went to work in Asia again afterwards, right? And I guess it's that aspect of home, right, where you feel comfortable in different places. And that's an advantage for you, right? That because you've lived in different countries, then where other people might not see that as, or understand the local culture in different places, you can go to different areas and thrive. And they mentioned about being a management consultant, and I think we can mention this, who you sat next to as well. So it's that kind of high performing environment. Can we say who you sat next to?
I guess so. Sure. Yeah. I mean, as well. So I sat next to Sujata from Monzo. I actually sat next to, he's not Asian, but one of the senior partners at Borderton Capital. The list goes on, right? So if you're in that environment, that just gives you an even greater sense of what's possible. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right.
And like from there, so you have said you tried one startup, which didn't quite work out. Can you tell us why that failed?
The list of points is insanely long, but you know, I guess I'll boil it down to two things. One is just structural, right? We were ahead of our time. In fact, I'm not even sure even now it would have worked. I'd like to believe so. But the second point was, and this is really key actually for some of the things that we might talk about later, we didn't know the game. Like, we were trying to pitch also to VCs in the States and other sort of sources of finance. And we didn't know the first thing about how to write a business plan, how to present ourselves. We didn't understand that even if our idea was really smart, we needed to make it more accessible to them, simplify it, and we needed to get into the lingo and improve our networking to get access to more sources of finance. And that really was a bit of a struggle for us. Well, thirdly, timing. It was just after the dot-com bust. But yeah, I mean, I would really focus on that second point because that was just something that we just couldn't get our heads around.
And then after having that experience, what made you then go and try and start up another thing again? Like, where did that inspiration come from? Did it hold you back at all, thinking like, oh, I tried it before and it didn't work out, or but if I do it again?
I'm a sucker for punishment. No, in fact, in a sense, that was why I wanted to try it again. I thought, part of me thought I had unfulfilled business. I had sort of asked myself, look, what do I want out of life and out of my career? And to the point that we talked about before, I didn't really know exactly what I wanted, but I knew what that feeling was. And part of that feeling was that sense of independence and of making something and making something happen. And you know, trying your hand at a hypergrowth startup. I mean, that's sort of the quintessence of that. And so that was a really big driver for me to have a go again.
And obviously you managed to do that. What was the idea? Tell the audience, like, what actually happened there?
So I was one of the 3 co-founders of a business called Payleven. Payleven is a mobile point of sale device, and we were one of the first to go live, pan-European. In fact, I think we were live in the most markets in Europe in the early days. And what we were doing was we were basically providing a device that could help you process a card payment that would connect to your phone, so you didn't have to use the expensive equipment that traditional people would provide you with. And on top of that was mobile. So anywhere where you had mobile phone connectivity, it would work. And we were also riding the wave of the massive uptick in card payments, which we've now seen over the last decade. The reason why this idea won't sound that strange to people nowadays is because, you know, our successor organizations have, you know, gone on to really fulfill that vision. What happened ultimately to our business was we merged with another company that was roughly the same size as us, and that business, SumUp, I believe by last count, actually in terms of processing volume, is the largest processor in Europe that provides something like that, ahead of, you know, some other brands, including an American brand called Square.
So what made you get into it in the first place? Like, why that problem? So obviously it's like interesting now because when you talk about it, it's like, that's obvious, right? Because we all use it. We go to, like, when I had my food at lunch, when I picked it into the market, I probably used a payment thing that was done by SumUp, right? But at the time, it wasn't obvious that kind of was going to be about. So what made you believe in the idea that this was something which you wanted to take that risk on and throw yourself into?
Yeah, a couple of things. I mean, the first one was just, I had not too long before that lived in the States. And it wasn't Square in particular, but it was just more card acceptance in the States. And then especially, I mean, the UK card penetration is reasonably high, but when you go to France or especially go to Germany, you know, you couldn't convince them to take your card payment, even if you would pay extra. They just wanted cash. So that was obviously just an observation that this was something that over time needed to happen. We needed to have more electronic-based payments. I think the second piece is, you know, what does accepting card payments do for a merchant? It actually often helps them earn more money. And there's the hidden cost of cash in terms of the effort to handle, do the reconciliation and processing. If you've digitized it, you can actually very materially accelerate, you know, your bookkeeping at the end. So kind of understanding all of these things. And, you know, I mentioned my first failed startup back in the early days. Totally different world. It was in travel tech. But again, it was about empowering small businesses. And like I said, I come from a family of entrepreneurs, many of whom actually weren't doing like venture-backed businesses, but doing their own businesses. And so I've long had an interest in things at the smaller end, smaller merchant end. Mm-hmm. So this was a really perfect coming together of, you know, 2 or 3 major strands and a huge opportunity. I mean, literally millions and millions, tens of millions of small merchants were not accepting card payments back in the day. So there was just this tremendous white space for us to do something better.
And you said you had a couple of co-founders as well, right?
Yes.
So how did you work that relationship out? Like what was your role and how did you divvy up those responsibilities? Because I think that's a huge problem for so many founders of who does what.
You know, I would love to tell you that we were sort of really thoughtful about it. In our case, it kind of just fell out naturally. So I was introduced to Raphael and Constantine through mutual friends, and we first started sniffing around the idea. And also, full disclosure, it was actually more Raphael and Constantine who were the original people with the idea, and then I sort of loved it, and we got involved. But Raphael was actually, at that point in time, already 12 years in payments, and CTO and technical guy. So guess which was the bit that he was obviously going to do. And Constantine had already some pretty good experience in terms of customer acquisition and online marketing. So that was the bit that he was going to do. So it kind of just naturally fell out from there.
And then what was the bit that you did there?
Oh, yeah. Sorry. Yeah, so I was the COO of the business. And in a payments company, that's actually a very broad description. So one part of what I was doing was actually taking care of the customers from the moment they said they wanted the service, because it's also a regulated service. And so unlike many other things, it isn't just a case of somebody saying, oh, I want to buy this. We actually would then also have to choose whether we could accept them, because at the end of the day, it is a banking related product. And so I was taking care care of everything that was involved from that point onwards. So that meant I was customer support, customer service. I was feeding back to the product team what they needed, but I was also then working with our partners, everyone from the regulators, because we were a regulated payment institution, as well as companies like Visa and MasterCard, and trade associations as well. So I had a very broad role. You could say that I was doing everything that wasn't obviously tech and everything that wasn't obviously sales and marketing.
And what was it about that role that you enjoyed? And think about it as well, because you had this corporate career where you worked in management consulting. How was that feeling of working on something which you were a part of, like in that way? Because obviously there's many people listening today who probably are working at a management consulting firm, they're working in banking, and they have this idea that one day I want to do something like what you've done, but it's a big unknown for them, it's a big uncertainty. Like, how was that transition for you to get really your hands dirty again?
The transition, if I'm going to be honest, was really easy in one regard, because I wanted to do something like this for such a long time. This was real. This was rolling up my sleeves. This was making it happen. And every day, even if it was something as basic as, oh, I've now written the new legal document and I've made our application to the FCA, that was progressing the business. So from that perspective, it was really, really easy. But what I would say to anyone who does aspire to be an entrepreneur is you should go in with your eyes wide open. So the positives are, I think you will never have a better day in your career, in your working life, than as a founder of a business when things go right. I mean, orders of magnitude better. And like I said, I've had like 5 different careers in my life across 5 different industries. So I can say that with confidence. Many founders say it's almost addictive, because, I mean, those highs are so high and you are making an impact. You're making an impact not just on your customers and on the world, but also on your team, right? Because there's something just so exciting about it. On the flip side, I think you also have to recognize that the lows are some of the lowest you'll ever have in your career. And the stress is high. And it's that roller coaster. One of the best days in my career at Payleven was on that same day, one of the worst things that ever happened. It was mental. And I would not give up those experiences for anything else, though, and that sense that it's yours and it's your team's, like, no one can ever take that away from you, regardless whether you succeed or not.
And could you share like what some of those massive highs were and some of those lows as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's as simple as shipping product that first day. It took us nearly 12 months because we had to get regulated, we had to build a technical solution, we then had to test it, and then we had to integrate with 5 other partners as well. And then we also had hardware components. So it was just a massively complex thing. And so that first day, just before we started shipping product, we actually built a pyramid out of our hardware devices. And then for that very first customer live started processing, like everybody was like stamping their feet and clapping and cheering. It was just amazing. So, I mean, that's just on the one hand, a very simple example, but hopefully I've brought to life like the blood, sweat, and tears that brought up to it. On the flip side, like the worst days were, when it didn't work out with an individual. Unfortunately, that is the nature of things. And, there were people that we had to show the door to. That's the hardest at the end of the day, because, it's still a people business. You're doing this because you also want to grow the organization, and, having to let a member of your team go. And that can sometimes be quite acrimonious as well, even if it's the right thing to do for the team. And dare I say it, sometimes even the right thing for that individual. Because, if the organization, if there's not a good fit, I mean, that's not going to be the best progress for your career. But that can seem very patronizing saying that at the time. In fact, I may have said that at the time and not done it quite right, which may have increased the acrimony. So that was definitely one of the hardest moments. That and the couple of times where we were only a few weeks away from totally running out of cash and having to shut down the whole business. Yeah, maybe that one's also a little bit stressy.
Yeah, and what are some of the mistakes you made as well? Because obviously we can say like it went amazingly and you got merged, but obviously even with all of that background you had, there's still be mistakes you made and things that didn't quite go to plan. And what did you learn from that you can share so hopefully a few people listening don't make those mistakes?
So the actual list is just so insanely long because I do subscribe to the fact that you learn more from your mistakes. But let me highlight probably a couple of things. The first one that I would highlight is thinking about the quality of your team, especially if you're trying to build a hypergrowth startup scale up. You're doing something very, very unnatural, right? I mean, you're trying to not even double every year, which is already insane, but actually for your first few years, you're trying to triple or more every year. And to find the people who can be on that journey and willing to roll up their sleeves right now, but still be good enough for the organization a year or two down the line you've got to be so careful about whom you hire. And I kind of alluded to that earlier. We did cut corners, and perhaps we didn't quite hire at the caliber that we needed to because we were, watching the pennies. So we were penny wise, pound foolish. So, hiring really top talent, obviously making sure you can afford them, but hiring really top talent and asking yourself the question, is this the right person in all regards? Technical skills, but emotional skills as well, for today, but also for tomorrow. So that was probably the one huge thing. The second thing was, for us, again, I alluded to this earlier, not sufficiently appreciating the game. Something I take great pride in 12 years now after we launched the business was that strategically, we called it so right. Obviously, there's many things in the detail that have changed, but big picture, what you see a company like SumUp or Zettel doing in the market today, it's almost exactly what we called out in our initial business plan back in 2011, 2012. So I take great pride in that. But on the flip side, these huge blind spots that we had, we were first-time founders. And to be absolutely honest, we developed a huge chip on our shoulder that in retrospect meant that we actually showed really badly to the VCs because we thought that we had to be smarter, work harder, be clearer about our strategy and really deliver on our promises more than our competitors. And that was totally true. But actually what that meant was, and this is the reason why ultimately in the end it was only an okay result, was we lost the war for capital. We lost the war because we didn't play the game. We didn't know how to play that game on the fundraising side. So how could we have been more thoughtful, thinking through all of the aspects of our strategy of our business, not just the operational strategy and sort of the commercial strategy, but the financing strategy and the people strategy. Those were two pretty big blind spots for us.
So you mentioned there as an okay result, right? So with the merger, how did that actually work? Because I've had many people on here who've been acquired, right? But to have two companies of similar size merged together is something that many people haven't experienced or wouldn't know how to relate to that. So how was that experience for you? One, I guess, once you got approached or whether you approached them, and then going through the actual steps of doing that.
Yeah, well, so candidly, 7-8 years on, it's a lot easier to say now because we all still have shares in SumUp, and SumUp's last external valuation was $8.5 billion. But, that can wash away a lot of sins. At the time, it was pretty tough, right? So there was a fair chunk of eating humble pie. There was definitely an acknowledgement that even though we were a similar size, let's be honest, we were going to be the junior partners in this. And ultimately, there was not going to be a seat at the table for, yours truly. Mm-hmm. And there was a lot of soul searching there. But I think we were also objective enough to know that the market would benefit from consolidation. This was long-term the right thing to do because we were then going to create, ultimately like a really strong organization. And if I'm going to be totally honest, I sort of knew it in my heart of hearts, but at least me personally, at that point in time, we were a 150-person organization. I was tapping out as a manager. My co-founders may beg to differ, but I thought that I was absolutely awesome between 0 and 50 people. I was totally fine between 50 and 100. Somewhere between the 100 and 150, I started becoming just, not that great as a senior leader and as a manager. And I alluded to it before, not everyone can scale with their organizations. And, I think that was a learning journey for me that is now a learning journey that I talk about with the founding teams of the startups that I back. And, there's an irony there because professionally, I've had tons of experience as an advisor and even as an operator in a 1,000+ person organization. And, I've invested in previous lives and as a managing consultant, advised companies with 5,000, 10,000+ employees. And I've started myself and done okay from 0 to 100, kind of understanding what you're good at and what you're not good at. So coming back to it, sorry, I've sort of meandered a little bit around the topic, but, knowing where your own limitations are. And a few months later, there was almost relief because I wasn't a good manager because I was really good one-on-one, but trying to get that scale, I wasn't scaling as a manager to manage now an organization where my direct reports, I can't remember, like 4 or 5. And then ultimately we were responsible for 50 or 60 people out of that 150. And I was not scaling at doing that. And so that relief that I couldn't quite explain, it only dawned on me, frankly, 2 years later that I was like, It's because I wasn't actually any good at doing that job. So yeah, coming back to it, it was the right thing strategically, but actually in my heart of hearts, part of me knew it was the right thing for me. And so that was how I got over emotionally the fact that, we were pulling this together with one of our competitors.
I really love that as well, because you hear sometimes people will talk about how everything they did was perfect, right? Or they made all the right decisions. And that's not the reality, right? As you said, it's even with management and leadership, I think that's one of the hardest bit. And you mentioned it earlier as well about the people side of the business, is that you can see a problem, solve a problem. When it's with people are way more complicated than coding or anything like that. And trying to get the relationship right, when you've got a small organization is one thing. When you've got so many people working up to you, and then you have to, on one hand, think about making sure the organization is doing what it needs to do, but at the same time trying to balance these interpersonal relationships, it is a very stressful thing to do. And for some people, it's something they're natural at. And it's a classic thing of corporations, right? Of where to get promoted, to get paid more, you have to manage more people. But it might not actually be what you're good at.
Yeah.
It might be actually really good at this technical part. You're really good at your job, but you're not a good manager. And that's one of the struggles of different people. It's like, okay, I want to get paid more, but then I have to take on management and I'm not a good manager. And I think it's something which a lot of people now are trying to think about in a different way of like, how can we have these different paths of people where instead of making them a manager, we can actually just get them to be the bit that they're in their zone of genius of.
Yes. Look, I mean, huge topic. If you find the ultimate solution, please let me know first. But it's something that I discuss with my founders as well, right? Because now we're talking about how they're growing their organization and how they can do that. And, everybody solves it in a slightly different way. And like I said, I wish we could find the panacea, but absolutely, right? I mean, especially working in tech, these are people organizations. You don't actually create that much tangible IP. So it's your people. And recognizing exactly that, how can you get the most of them? Because otherwise you do have that paradox that you're going to promote people to their point of incompetence, and then ultimately you're setting them up for failure, and nobody wants that ultimately.
So you mentioned there about helping the founders there, right? So we haven't got too much time left, but I'd love to get into your transition into venture capital and what was behind that and how you found that journey now.
So, because I'm jack of all trades, master of none, and at the same time, I really empathize with founders, I think I've been lucky to stumble in on this. And I love the variety. I love the variety of different business models. 8 Roads is a pan-European fund, so I love the variety of geographies and cultures and problems that we're trying to solve. And I talked about the founder's journey and the company's journey, and I love that sort of that whole life cycle. And so that sort of suits me down to a T. Someone far more illustrious a VC than I correctly said, VCs in many ways are actually anthropologists who just happen to do finance, and I totally subscribe to that. I love having these conversations, thinking about people, organizations, and thinking about the one-to-one relationships with founders. So that's been really exercising. And like I said, I found out that I was tapping out as a manager, and part of the reason for that was I was definitely one of these more project guys. I love running around from one project to another. I don't want to say VC is exactly like that, because I also have relationships with my portfolio companies that last, 5, 6, 7 or more years. But there is still much more of a project-based element to it, and being a problem solver and not actually having to manage tons and tons of people. So it turns out that actually suits me better.
You've obviously made a few investments so far. What are some of the ones which maybe you backed them where other people weren't looking at that and it's kind of proven right? So where do you feel quite validated?
At the time when we invested in a Norwegian company called Tibber. So Tibber is not just a green energy retailer, but they do 2 or 3 things very, very different from anybody else we think in the whole of Europe. The first one is they are much deeper tech on the customer experience. So you get an app, it has pre-integrations with your whole smart home capabilities. And this enables you to do smart charging and enables you to control everything from your energy from that app. And a lot of people were saying, well, why are you trying to do this? This is a company that's founded out of a 50,000 population town on the west coast of Norway. Isn't that story kind of played out? We're seeing it here in Europe, and on top of that, we're seeing it here in the UK, and how are you going to scale that across multiple countries? And so definitely that took a lot of flack. But that was one where recognizing the founders were really on something very different and that they were able to scale across multiple countries. That's definitely been one that's really inspired me. I know that's not a UK example, but it's just something that's really captured that zeitgeist now. We were very lucky to get there, a little bit earlier than anybody else.
And before we were talking as well, you mentioned how like 8 Roads is really specialized within Europe and trying to help those companies, and you've got that expertise there. What do you think it is about 8 Roads that enables you to really make a difference to the companies that you invest in?
So we're part of a global organization. So we have teams in the US as well as in all of the major tech hubs in Asia. And that's full investment teams feet on the ground. So having that global mindset and that global access, that is one key point of differentiation. The second point I would make is we are very actively involved, and either as the investors or as advisors, we specifically choose people who have startup scale-up experience and expertise. So people who have been founders and have led organizations. So they've been head of sales, they've been head of marketing, product, CS, tech, etc., of companies that have scaled from $1 or $2 million to hundreds of millions of dollars. So I like to say we have people in our team in everything that's relevant for scale-ups who have both the IQ and the EQ to be helpful. I think the third thing, though, at the end of the day is I would like to believe that we are pretty down-to-earth people. And having that sense of service towards our founders, I really buy into that, because if I'd had that support, maybe I would still be on that side of the table. We really talk about and measure actively how we're doing with our founders, and we even measure our net promoter score with them. So that's very much something that we live and breathe by.
And what excites you most about your future of 8 Roads?
On the big picture level, I think just the opportunities here in the UK and in Europe for tech. Yes, we're going through a bit of a downturn right now, but that opportunity is just huge. The population in Western Europe as a whole is slightly more than the US. There are 2 times the number of technical developers, and yet the average salary is 40% less than the US. And on top of that, the total investment in tech is 60% less than the US. So just structurally, there's so much opportunity here, and we're already seeing it with more 1 billion, 10 billion, even 50 billion companies being created. So from a big picture perspective, that's super exciting. On the bottom up, it's this opportunity that I talked about to continue to add value. I'm hopefully getting better at my job. I'm hopefully showing more track record and being able to hone my advice with the founders. And so, the venture game is a multi-year, almost multi-decade thing to get better at. So I'm constantly being challenged, and I'm constantly seeing more opportunity. I mean, that's a great coming together of what you need to build a career.
So we're going to need to do quick fire questions now.
Sure.
But first one, who are 3 British Asians you'd love to spotlight that you think people in the audience should be paying attention to?
I don't know them, and I don't know a ton about the specific details, but the Issa brothers, so do you know Mohsen and Zuba Issa? I mean, these guys started off with one petrol station in Bury, Lancashire. They then built like a multi-billion business of petrol stations and forecourts, and then they bought Asda from Walmart, the world's biggest retailer. I mean, enough said, right?
Yep.
So, I mean, that's just a phenomenal story. The second person I would highlight, of course, is Will Shu from Deliveroo. I mean, just phenomenal business, and just the sheer drive. I mean, the guy still pedals on his bike to deliver for himself as well. So at that personal level, that's just phenomenal, staying in touch with the customer. The third one is a gentleman who's no longer with us, sadly. So David Tang, he's originally Hong Kong Chinese, but he was also a well-known entrepreneur and an investor and philanthropist here in the UK. So he founded a business called Shanghai Tang, which is really cool, retro chic Shanghainese wear. He also founded Chinese restaurants, including China Tang, which is one of the best Chinese restaurants in London. But he was also an advisor to the London Symphony Orchestra, and he was a journalist, a columnist for the FT. I almost think about him as like being a kind of an Asian Oscar Wilde in terms of his acerbic wit. So I mean, this guy was a real Renaissance man. I didn't know him, but actually my aunt was lucky enough to consider him one of her, her great friends. And just the style and panache and creativity that he had. And so, I talk about these 3 guys because they have done things in different spheres, but they talk about, the different aspects of, how great British entrepreneurs, British Asian entrepreneurs can be, across all different spectrums of industry.
Awesome. So if people want to find out more about you, find out more about 8 Roads, where should they go to?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so our website, 8roads.com, has tons of information about our teams, our investments, and myself. Or hit me up on LinkedIn.
If there's anything that you need help with, what can the audience help you with?
Always up for hearing, especially about new cutting edge technologies and cutting edge ideas. I spend a lot of my time in FinTech, so always interested to hear about that. I also spend a lot of my time in the more deep tech and tech infrastructure. So those are 3 areas I'm particularly interested in. And I think those are also areas which are constantly innovating and where Britain's at the cutting edge. So please, let me know if there's anything good.
So thank you so much for coming on. It's been really insightful. Have you got any final words for the audience?
Yeah, I think the last thing, if I could say, because we didn't get a chance to touch on it, and it is something I'm fairly passionate about, is this awareness and understanding of what is possible. I think what has held back, if I may say, many British Asian entrepreneurs is not knowing the game, not understanding how it works, this broad picture of, for you to be successful as a business, you also need to have networking, you need to understand the financing side of things, and the art of the possible. And I think British Asians, on that mom and pop shop level, I mean, dare I say it, I think we are some of the best. And actually the amount of personal risk and effort to build a hyper-scaling business, it's actually no greater. It's different in certain areas. You've got to handle more stakeholders and there's many other elements. But actually, if you can build a very successful bootstrap business, well, you have the capabilities to go and do something else that could also scale and become like the next tech unicorn. So if I could just find a way to encourage more awareness and more sense of what's possible, I think that would be really powerful for the whole community.
Hello everyone. Thank you so much for listening. It means a huge amount to us. And we don't think you realise how important you are. Because if you subscribe to our YouTube channel, if you leave us a 5-star review, it makes a world of difference. And if you believe in what we're trying to do here, to inspire, connect and guide the next generation of British Asians, if you do those things, you can help us achieve that mission. And you can help us make a bigger impact. And by doing that, it means we can get bigger guests, we can host more events, we can do more for the community. So you can play a huge part. So thank you so much for supporting us.